Midnight. The rain came down so hard, it felt like the sky itself was trying to wash away what had just happened inside that house. A young woman in a torn white dress ran barefoot through the woods behind a sprawling mansion, her breath breaking apart in sharp, frightened gasps as branches tore at her arms and mud swallowed her feet with every desperate step. Her hands were bleeding from where she had clawed her way over a jagged stone wall, and every time she looked back, all she could see were beams of white light slicing through the darkness like knives. Black SUVs rolled across the wet grounds behind her, their engines growling low, their headlights cutting through the storm as men in dark suits spread out with flashlights and moved like trained hunters who had done this before. She was trembling, soaked to the bone, terrified, but she kept running because she knew one thing with absolute certainty. If they caught her tonight, she didn't know if she would ever get another chance. He bought her like she was nothing, but the moment she tried to escape him, he hunted her down like she was the most valuable thing he had ever owned. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, whether you're in Georgia, Moscow, Ohio, California, New York, Mexico City, Tokyo. Drop your location below. And if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because what happened on this stormy night would lead to a truth so shocking that by the end of this story, you may never look at love, loyalty, or family the same way again. She could hear them closing in. Their boots crushing wet leaves, men shouting over the thunder. One voice barked that she was heading for the main road. Another ordered the north gate sealed. She stumbled hard, falling to her knees in the mud, and for one split second she almost broke. Her body was exhausted, her ankle throbbed, her lungs burned, and the cold had sunk so deep into her skin it made her teeth shake. But fear is a strange thing. It can make a person weak, and it can also make a person run farther than they ever believed possible. She pushed herself up again and kept moving, clutching the torn fabric of her dress against her chest as she reached the edge of the trees. Just beyond them was the road. Just beyond that road was freedom. She could almost taste it. She could almost imagine what it would feel like to disappear into the night, to find a bus station, a motel, a crowded diner, anywhere with lights and strangers and ordinary people who had no idea that a few hours earlier her own father had handed her over to one of the most feared men in the city, like she was payment on an unpaid bill. She was only steps away from the road when a hand shot out of the darkness and grabbed her wrist so hard she cried out. She fought like someone fighting for her life, because that was exactly what this was. She twisted, kicked, screamed, clawed at the man holding her, but he was bigger, stronger, trained for chaos, and within seconds, another bodyguard closed in from the side. She was trapped. Rain soaked her hair across her face as she screamed at them to let her go, begged them, cursed them, told them she would rather die than go back. But one of the men tightened his grip and dragged her backward toward the trees. She was sobbing now, not because she had given up, but because she understood how close she had come. So close that she could hear the cars on the road beyond the trees. So close that if she had gotten there 10 seconds earlier, maybe everything would have been different. Then, from the darkness behind the men, came a voice so calm and so cold that both bodyguards froze instantly. "Don't touch her!" The command cut through the storm like a blade. The man holding her let go at once. She stumbled forward, nearly falling again, and then she saw him. He stepped out from the shadows in a black suit soaked with rain, broad shoulders straight, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the air around her feel thinner. He was the man everyone feared, or the man her father had sold her to, the man whose name made grown men lower their voices in public and check over their shoulders in private. Ethan Kane. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten her. He didn't grab her the way his men had. He simply walked toward her slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt again at any second. And when he reached her, he looked down at her bare feet, her cut hands, her shaking body, and something unreadable passed across his face. Then he took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders himself. She recoiled from him, backing away, breathing hard, trying to hold on to the last scraps of anger, because anger was easier than fear, and fear was easier than the strange confusion she felt in that moment. Why would a man who had just sent half his security team to chase her through the woods stop his own bodyguards from touching her? Why would a man who could have dragged her back by force wrap her in his coat like he was trying to protect her from the cold? Why would a man who had every reason to be furious look at her like she had nearly scared him to death? "You don't get to run from me," he said quietly, but there was no cruelty in his voice, only something harder to understand, something heavier. "Not tonight." She stared at him through tears and rain and hatred and panic, and the only words she could force out were the same ones she had been repeating in her head since the moment her father signed those papers. "I hate you." Ethan didn't flinch. He just looked at her for a long moment, then answered in a voice so low she almost didn't hear it over the thunder. "I know." That should have been the end of it. That should have been the moment he ordered his men to drag her back inside that mansion, lock every gate, and remind her exactly who held the power. But instead, he did something that made no sense at all. He stepped between her and his bodyguards, as if shielding her from them, looked over his shoulder, and warned every one of them that if anyone ever put their hands on her like that again, they would answer to him personally. The men lowered their heads at once. No arguments, no hesitation. Then he turned back to her, and, for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw something in his face that terrified her more than his reputation ever could. It wasn't rage, it wasn't arrogance, it wasn't possession. It was concern, real concern, the kind that belongs to someone who has something to lose. And that was the moment the story truly began. Because if Ethan Kane was just a monster, this would have been simple. Monsters are easy to hate. Monsters are easy to run from. Monsters do not stand in the rain shaking with restrained anger because the woman they chased almost got hurt. But Ethan Kane was not simple, and that was the one thing Claire Bennett had not been prepared for. Hours earlier, Claire had still believed she understood exactly how her life worked. She believed in ordinary things. Morning coffee before work, paychecks that barely stretched, a tiny apartment she shared with a man she no longer recognized as her father. She believed that if she worked hard enough, stayed patient enough, sacrificed enough, that eventually she would get out. Eventually she would leave behind the bills, the shouting, the late-night excuses, the lies about where the money went, the strange bruises on his knuckles, the way he jumped every time a car slowed down outside their building. But desperation can turn a home into a trap long before anyone realizes it, and by the time Claire understood just how bad things were, the deal had already been made. Her father, Richard Bennett, had always been the kind of man who promised tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he would stop gambling. Tomorrow he would pay back what he owed. Tomorrow he would be the father she remembered from childhood, before her mother died, and everything inside him seemed to collapse. Tomorrow he would fix it. But tomorrow never came. What came instead were loan sharks, empty bottles, their whispers on the phone, locked bathroom doors, and one final debt he could never repay. And when the men came to collect, he made the kind of choice that no daughter should ever have to survive. Claire had walked into the house that evening, carrying grocery bags, and found two men in expensive suits sitting at the kitchen table like they belonged there. Her father's face was grey. His hands were shaking. One of the men smiled too easily. The other never spoke at all. There was a document on the table, a pen beside it, and a silence so heavy it made her skin go cold before anyone said a word. She asked what was going on, and her father told her to sit down. She didn't. He told her again, louder this time, but she stayed standing because something in her already knew that once she sat, her life would split into a before and an after. Then the smiling man leaned back in his chair and said her name like he'd known it for years. Claire Bennett, 24, works weekdays, walks home alone, no husband, no brothers, no one coming to save her. Her father started crying before she did. That was the moment she understood she was not in a conversation. She was in a transaction. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he could not even meet her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, and the room became very quiet. "What did you do?" He told her it wasn't supposed to happen like this. He told her he had no other choice. He told her she would be safe. Safe. The word hit her like an insult. The smiling man slid the paper closer. Her father had signed it. His signature was crooked, rushed, desperate. Claire snatched the document and read just enough to feel the room tilt around her. Debt settlement, transfer of custody, protective possession under private arrangement, legal words designed to dress up something ugly enough to ruin a soul. "No," she said immediately, backing away from the table. "No, no, no, no." Her father stood up, reaching for her, but she jerked away like his touch burned. "You sold me?" The question came out broken, half scream, half disbelief, because even when the evidence is in your hand, some betrayals are too large for the mind to accept at once. He started saying her name, saying he loved her, saying this was temporary, saying the man taking her was honorable compared to the others, saying she would understand later, or saying all the things weak people say when they are trying to make their own cowardice sound like sacrifice. Claire looked at the door, calculated the distance, and made a run for it, but the silent man blocked her before she got 2 steps. She screamed then. She screamed so hard her throat hurt. She screamed at her father, at the men, at the whole rotten universe that could allow a daughter to stand in her own kitchen and hear the person who raised her explain that being handed over to a stranger was somehow the best option left. Then the front door opened, and every person in that room went still. Ethan Kane entered without hurry, and somehow that made it worse. He didn't storm in like a thug. He didn't posture. He didn't need to. He walked into that tiny, broken house, wearing a dark overcoat and carrying the kind of silence that makes everyone else feel loud. Claire had heard his name before, of course. Everyone in the city had. He was the man whispered about in upscale restaurants and back alley bars alike. The one with businesses on paper and blood in the rumors. The one politicians pretended not to know and criminals prayed not to cross. He stepped over the threshold and took in the room in one sweep. The trembling father, the 2 debt collectors, the unsigned fear hanging in the air, and Claire standing near the counter, clutching a crumpled page like it might somehow save her. When his eyes met hers, she expected hunger. She expected triumph. She expected the cold satisfaction of a man collecting what he believed he had purchased. Instead, what she saw was something far more confusing. Recognition, like he already knew exactly who she was. One of the men started to explain the arrangement, but Ethan silenced him with a glance. Then he looked at Richard Bennett and asked one question in a voice so controlled it chilled the room. "Did you tell her the truth?" Richard started stammering. Ethan's jaw tightened. He took the paper from Claire's hand, scanned it, and for the first time there was a visible shift in him, a flash of anger so sharp that even the men beside him straightened. "This is not what I authorized," he said. Every word landed like a threat. The smiling man quickly insisted the terms had been adjusted for efficiency, that Richard agreed, that rival buyers had been circling, that time was short, that taking the girl immediately was the safest move. Claire barely understood what any of that meant, it because her mind had snagged on 2 words that changed everything and somehow made nothing better at all. Rival buyers. Buyers. There had been more than one man willing to take her. More than one man discussing her future like she was a piece of property on a ledger. She turned to her father again, but he was crying too hard to speak. Ethan took one slow step toward him, and for a second Claire thought he was going to kill him right there in the kitchen. Instead, he leaned close and said something that Claire would not fully understand until much later. If I hadn't stepped in, she would already be gone. Then he straightened, looked at Claire, and said, "Get your coat." She laughed in his face, because what else was left? "I'm not going anywhere with you." Ethan held her gaze. "Tonight, you either leave with me, or they come back for you by morning. And if they come back, I won't be able to stop what happens next." She wanted to call him a liar, She wanted to believe this was another layer of manipulation. But when she looked at the two men at the table, they were no longer smiling. They were watching Ethan with the kind of tense caution that only exists when a dangerous man is the only thing standing between you and something worse. Claire refused 3 times. Ethan gave her the same answer each time. He did not threaten her. He did not raise his voice. He simply told her the truth as he saw it, and somehow that truth was more frightening than any threat could have been. Richard begged her to go. He actually begged. He dropped to his knees and grabbed at her hand, sobbing, telling her this was the only way, or telling her Ethan was the one man in this city who kept his word, telling her she would live if she went with him. Claire ripped her hand away and stared down at the man who had once taught her how to ride a bike, who had once stayed up all night when she had a fever, who had once been her whole world, and in that moment she saw him clearly. He was not a father. He was a frightened gambler, drowning in his own bad choices, willing to hand his daughter to a stranger and call it mercy, because he could not bear the cost of facing what he had done. Something in Claire cracked then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for a cold, hollow silence to settle inside her. She stopped crying. She stopped shouting. She picked up her coat with numb hands and walked past her father without looking at him. Ethan stepped aside to let her pass, and for reasons she could not explain, that small act of distance felt more powerful than if he had dragged her by force. The drive to Ethan Kane's estate was one long stretch of disbelief. Rain hit the windows in hard sheets, turning the city into a blur of smeared lights and dark shapes. Claire sat rigid in the back seat, pressed against the door, every muscle tense, every instinct screaming at her to do something, anything. But what? Jump from a moving car? Scream at a traffic light? There were 2 men in the front, both armed, both silent. Ethan sat beside her, but not too close, one hand resting on his knee, the other holding a phone he barely glanced at. He made one call. "We're coming in. Lock the east gate. Increase perimeter patrols. No one approaches her unless I say so." Her. Not by name. Not with affection. Or not with cruelty either. Just a command spoken by a man used to being obeyed. Claire turned to him then, unable to hold it in any longer. "What am I to you?" she asked. It was the question sitting under everything else. The contract, the ride, the guards, the impossible calm. Ethan looked out at the rain before answering. "Right now," he said. "A problem I intend to keep alive." The words should have horrified her, and they did. But there was something in the way he said them that lodged in her chest like a splinter. He wasn't talking like a buyer discussing property. He was talking like a man already at war with forces she could not yet see. By the time they reached the estate, Claire understood why people called it a fortress. The gates alone were taller than her apartment building's front entrance, black iron set into stone pillars, watched by cameras and men with earpieces. The driveway curved through acres of rain-dark trees before the mansion finally came into view, all sharp lines and glowing windows and cold wealth, the kind of house built by people who wanted the world to know they were untouchable. The car rolled under the covered entrance, and the moment the door opened, Claire made a choice that would define the rest of the night. She bolted. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She just ran. She slipped past the driver, hit the wet stone hard, nearly lost her footing, and took off across the side lawn before anyone fully registered what she had done. Behind her, voices exploded. Men shouted. A car door slammed. She didn't look back. She ran toward the trees because the trees meant darkness, and darkness meant a chance. She tore through hedges, scraped her leg on a broken branch, nearly crashed into a fountain she never saw until the last second. Somewhere behind her, someone yelled to cut her off near the west wall. Another voice ordered the dogs held back. She kept running. The world had narrowed to pure instinct. Escape, breathe, move, don't stop. She reached the wall on the western edge of the property, because in a flash of lightning she saw the old stone rise above the hedges and knew it was her only chance. It was slick with rain, uneven, cruel to climb, but terror can make fingers stronger than they should be. She hauled herself up, slipped, cut her palm open, climbed again, hooked a knee over the top, and dropped hard on the other side, landing badly enough to send pain shooting up her ankle. She nearly blacked out, but the road was close. She could hear it. She could hear real traffic beyond the trees. Normal life. Freedom. The kind of ordinary world that feels impossible once you've been pulled into the orbit of a man like Ethan Kane. So she forced herself up and ran again, bleeding, limping, shivering, driven by the one thought that mattered. If she stopped, she was finished. That was how she ended up in those woods. That was how the black SUVs found her. That was how the bodyguard caught her wrist just before the road. And that was how Ethan Kane, the man her father had sold her to, the man she had every reason to fear, ended up standing in the rain, wrapping his coat around her shoulders, like she was something fragile he could not afford to lose. When he led her back toward the waiting SUV, he did not touch her. That mattered more than she wanted to admit. He walked beside her, close enough to stop her from trying again, far enough that she could not accuse him of dragging her. The bodyguards kept their distance after his warning. No one spoke. Claire was still shaking too hard to think clearly, but pieces of the night kept crashing into each other in her mind. Her father's signature, rival buyers, Ethan's anger at the contract, the way he looked at her like he knew her, the way he had said this was not what he authorized, the way he had told his own men not to touch her. None of it fit. None of it made sense. If he was a monster, why did he seem furious at the idea that anyone else had gotten near her? If he was her captor, why did he seem more concerned with her bleeding hands than with punishing her for running? And if he truly meant to protect her, then why not tell her the truth? Why keep everything hidden behind those cold eyes and clipped answers? The storm raged around them as they reached the vehicle again, and when the driver opened the door, Claire turned to Ethan with all the fury she had left. "Why me?" she demanded. "Why did my father choose me? Why did you take me? What do you want from me?" Ethan stood there in the rain, his hair damp, his expression unreadable, the kind of man who looked like he had been built out of control and consequence. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he gave her the one answer guaranteed to haunt her. "Because if I hadn't," he said quietly, "you'd already belong to someone far worse." That was the first time Claire realized the story she had been told might be a lie. Not a small lie, a life-changing one. Because if Ethan Kane was telling the truth, then her father hadn't just sold her to pay a debt. He had thrown her into the middle of a war she knew nothing about. And if Ethan had truly stepped in to stop something worse, then what exactly had he saved her from? Why were there rival buyers? Why had her father seemed more afraid of the men at the kitchen table than of the man who controlled them? Why did Ethan look at the contract like he wanted to tear the entire room apart? Why did he speak to her like she mattered, even while insisting she had no choice? Most of all, why did the most feared man in the city look like the thought of losing her in those woods had shaken something loose inside him? Claire got into the SUV because there was nowhere else to go, but the questions came with her, pressing in from all sides, heavier than the rain, sharper than the cold. But by the time the mansion doors closed behind her for the second time that night, she understood only one thing for certain. She was trapped inside a story much larger than debt, much larger than fear, and the man at the center of it was either the reason her life had been destroyed or the only reason she was still alive. And if you think that was the worst part, it wasn't. Because once Claire stepped inside Ethan Kane's house, she expected chains, threats, locked doors, and the kind of cruelty people whisper about when they talk about men like him. Instead, what she found waiting for her on the other side of those grand doors was something so unexpected, so unsettling, and so dangerous to her heart that it would make escaping him even harder than being caught. Because Ethan Kane did not take her to a cell. He took her to a room prepared long before she arrived, and the moment Claire saw what was inside, she realized this had never been random. He had been expecting her. He had been planning for her. And somehow, That was even more frightening than the contract her father signed. Claire stepped inside Ethan Kane's mansion, with rain still dripping from her hair, mud staining the hem of her torn dress, and the kind of fear that makes every breath feel borrowed. She expected humiliation the moment those doors closed behind her. She expected cold laughter from strangers, locked hallways, commands barked in low voices, hands forcing her forward, the kind of treatment a woman gets when men believe she has already been reduced to a price. Instead, the grand foyer went completely silent the second Ethan entered beside her. The staff standing near the staircase lowered their eyes. 2 guards near the hallway straightened. A woman in her 50s wearing a dark tailored suit appeared from somewhere deeper in the house, her face composed, her posture calm. And before Claire could even understand what was happening, Ethan spoke in the same controlled tone he had used outside in the rain. "Get her warm clothes, medical kit, tea if she wants it. No one enters her room without permission. No one touches her. No exceptions." He did not look at the staff when he said it. He looked at Claire. Every word landed between them like a promise and a warning at the same time. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch too long, he added one more sentence that made everyone in the room go even stiller. "If anyone disobeys me, like they leave this house tonight." Claire stood there drenched and shaking, too stunned to move, because this was not how monsters behaved, at least not the simple kind. The older woman introduced herself as Mrs. Lawson and offered Claire a blanket, but Claire refused it out of pure instinct. She refused the tea. She refused the doctor. She refused the fresh clothes. She refused everything, because refusing was the only piece of control she had left. Ethan watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then told Mrs. Lawson to prepare the East Wing room and turned to leave. Claire snapped before she could stop herself. "That's it?" she demanded, her voice cracking from cold and anger. "You drag me here, chase me through the woods, and then what? You lock me up and pretend you're being kind." Ethan stopped halfway up the staircase and looked back at her. His face gave away almost nothing, but there was something in his eyes that felt heavier now, more tired than before. "You're not locked up," he said. "But until I know who knows you're here, you're not leaving the estate alone." Claire laughed bitterly. "That sounds exactly like being locked up." He held her gaze without flinching. "Call it whatever helps you hate me. It doesn't change the risk." Then he walked away, leaving her standing there with a dozen questions and no answers, and somehow that made him more infuriating than if he had screamed. The room they took her to was on the 2nd floor at the far end of a quiet hallway, and the moment Claire stepped inside, something deep in her stomach tightened. It was not a prison. It was not a guest room thrown together in a hurry. It was a space someone had prepared with care. The bed was large but not gaudy, dressed in soft, neutral linen. A fireplace glowed low on one wall. There were fresh towels folded in the bathroom, new clothes laid neatly on a chair, and on the small table by the window sat a book she had mentioned once, months earlier, in a conversation she had assumed no one important was listening to. Her pulse stumbled. She crossed the room, picked it up, and stared at the cover like it might explain itself. It was the exact edition she had once admired in a small downtown bookstore, the one she could not afford and had put back on the shelf with a laugh. She remembered that day suddenly, and too clearly. She had been arguing with the cashier about whether old novels were worth collecting, and there had been a tall man near the window in a dark coat, pretending to read while saying nothing at all. She had not paid much attention to him then. Now, standing in Ethan Kane's mansion with his coat still around her shoulders, Claire realized with a chill that he had been there. He had seen her before that kitchen, before the contract, before the debt was settled. He had known who she was long before her father sold her. That realization kept her awake long after Mrs. Lawson left. Claire changed clothes only because the wet dress clung to her skin like ice, then sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a blanket she still did not want, staring at the door as if it might open at any moment and reveal the real reason she had been brought there. No hours passed. No one came. The house was too quiet for a place that large, as though even the walls understood the danger of making noise around a man like Ethan Kane. She inspected the room with the sharp focus of someone looking for weakness. The windows were not barred, but they only opened a few inches. The hallway outside had 2 guards stationed at either end, polite but immovable. The staircase leading down split into 3 different corridors, all watched. There were cameras she pretended not to notice. Every elegant detail in the house was built around control. Not loud control, not crude control, the kind of control that doesn't need to announce itself, because it has already planned 3 moves ahead. By dawn, Claire had reached one conclusion that made her chest tighten all over again. Ethan had not improvised any of this. Whatever his reasons were, he had made space for her in his life before she ever crossed his threshold. The next morning, she found him in the dining room, seated alone at the far end of a table, long enough to make the room feel colder. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, turning the silverware and crystal into hard points of light. But Ethan himself looked like he belonged to the shadows no matter where he sat. He was dressed simply compared to the night before. Dark shirt, sleeves rolled once at the forearm, coffee untouched beside him, a stack of documents open at one side. When Claire entered, he looked up as if he had been expecting her at that exact moment. "Sit," he said. It was not a suggestion. She remained standing. "I'm not hungry." "Then don't eat." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Or sit anyway." Claire hated that she obeyed, but part of her needed something more than silence. She needed answers, and Ethan Kane was the only one in the city who seemed to have them. The moment she sat, he pushed a plate toward her without comment. Fruit, toast, eggs, simple, untouched, not lavish, not poisoned. That thought embarrassed her, but she could not help it. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "If I wanted to hurt you," he said evenly, lifting his coffee at last, "I wouldn't need breakfast to do it." Claire's jaw tightened. "You say that like it's supposed to comfort me." "It's not," he said. "It's supposed to save time." That should have shut her down, but instead it pushed her anger higher. "Fine," she snapped. "Then save us both more time and tell me what this is. Am I your hostage? Your insurance policy? Your trophy? My father sold me. Your men came to collect. And now I'm in a room you had ready before I even got here. So tell me the truth." Ethan set down his cup and studied her in a way that felt far too direct. "You are under my protection." Claire nearly laughed. "Protection? Is that what we're calling this?" "That's what it is." "From who?" He did not answer quickly enough. That was all Claire needed to know, that the truth was worse than she had imagined. "You don't get to hide behind that," she said, leaning forward now, the fear in her chest sharpening into fury. "You don't get to drag me into your house and tell me I should trust you because there are dangers you refuse to name." Ethan's face hardened, but not with temper, with restraint. "Trust is not required," he said. "Obedience is." Claire pushed back her chair so fast it scraped the floor. "Then there it is. There's the real man." She turned as if to leave, but Ethan's voice stopped her halfway to the door. "Sit down, Claire." Hearing her name in his mouth felt more intimate than it should have. She froze. "You do not understand the position you're in." She spun back around. "Then explain it." Ethan stood slowly, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of what he carried in his posture. Not just power, responsibility, pressure, the kind of burden that ages a man in places no one can see. "Your father did not simply lose money," he said. "He made promises to people who treat debt like blood. He lied to them. He moved money that didn't belong to him. He tried to use your name to buy time. When that failed, or others became interested," Claire's heart thudded. "Others?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Men who would have taken you without paperwork, without witnesses, and without limits." Claire stared at him, breathing shallowly now. "And you?" He met her gaze without blinking. "I set limits." She hated how that answer landed in her. She hated that a part of her, the part still shaking from the woods, understood exactly what he meant. It did not make him innocent. It did not erase the contract or the terror or the fact that she was still trapped inside his estate. But it complicated him, and complication is dangerous when you are trying to keep someone in the shape of a villain. Claire wanted him to be simple. She wanted to pour all her fear and rage into a clear container and label it Ethan Kane. Instead, at every conversation with him, cracked that container a little more. She asked him if he had been watching her before the debt. He did not answer. She asked him why there was a room prepared. He did not answer. She asked him if he had arranged her father's fall. His expression changed then, only for a second, but she saw it. Offense. Not theatrical. Not wounded pride. Real offense. Your father destroyed himself without my help, he said quietly. Don't confuse my intervention with the cause. Then he moved around the table, close enough that she could smell clean soap and coffee and rain lingering in his coat from the night before, and stopped just far enough away to remind her he was choosing not to crowd her. You are free to hate me, he said. You are free to blame me. But if you step outside those gates alone right now, or someone else will find you first, and they will not bring you back in one piece. He left her standing there with those words and walked out, and the worst part was that she believed him. The days that followed should have settled into routine, but nothing about life inside Ethan Kane's mansion felt ordinary. Claire expected surveillance and found it. She expected guards and found them too, but she also found rules that seemed designed less to control her than to keep everyone else away from her. No male staff entered her room. No one questioned her movements inside the house. She could roam the library, the gardens within the inner grounds, the east terrace, the indoor pool wing. The music room no one seemed to use. Every door she tried within the estate opened. Only the outer exits were monitored. Only the gates were forbidden. Mrs. de Lawson became the nearest thing to a safe presence, bringing meals when Claire skipped them, leaving books on the table without comment, sometimes lingering just long enough to study her with an expression that felt oddly sympathetic. It was Mrs. Lawson who finally said what no one else would. He has never had a woman stay here before. Claire looked up sharply. That's supposed to make me feel better. Mrs. Lawson's face remained neutral. No, it is simply the truth. She hesitated, then added, Mr. Kane is many things. Careless is not one of them. Claire wanted to ask more, but the older woman left before she could, and those words stayed behind like a challenge. On the fourth night, Claire saw a version of Ethan no rumor could have prepared her for. She had been unable to sleep and wandered the hallways after midnight. Now, following the faint sound of piano music, she could barely hear through the quiet. It led her to a small sitting room at the back of the house, one she had not noticed before, the door half open. Inside, Ethan sat alone at an old grand piano with the lights low, not performing, not showing off, just playing slowly like someone remembering something painful. Claire stood in the hallway and listened, stunned. The man who ordered armed guards with a glance was sitting in the dark, playing a piece so restrained and sad it felt like a confession without words. She should have left. Instead, she stayed until he sensed her presence and stopped without turning. You're awake, he said. Claire almost jumped. Apparently so are you. Ethan looked over his shoulder at her. There was no irritation in his face, only fatigue. You should be in bed. And you should be telling me why the most feared man in the city plays piano in the middle of the night. One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. Bad habits, he said. Claire crossed her arms. You have a lot of those. More than you know. He turned back to the keys, but he did not start playing again. Go back to sleep, Claire. She should have gone. Instead, she stepped into the room. No. The silence between them shifted. Dangerous, intimate, unsteady. Why are you really keeping me here? She asked, softer now. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. Because I said I would. To who? He did not answer. My father? Still nothing. Someone else? Ethan finally stood, and when he turned to face her fully, whatever softness the music had suggested vanished behind that familiar wall again. There are things you are safer not knowing. Claire's temper sparked instantly. You keep saying that like it's noble. It's not. It's manipulation. Ethan took a slow breath, and for the first time she saw his control strain. No, he said quietly. It's triage. Then he walked past her and out of the room, leaving the last note of the piano hanging in the air, like a question neither of them was ready to answer. It became impossible after that to see him as just one thing. Claire watched him from the edges of rooms, the way people watch storms through glass, drawn and wary all at once. She saw how the guards responded to him with something deeper than fear, respect, sharpened by caution. She saw how he handled conflict without wasted motion. A raised voice from a man in the study became silence after Ethan entered. A supplier who arrived angry left pale and apologizing. When a young kitchen worker dropped a tray and nearly cut herself on shattered glass, Ethan was the first to kneel, not because he was kind in some soft, easy way, but because he acted faster than everyone else and expected competence from himself before anyone around him. He handed the girl a towel, told her to get stitches, and then looked up to find Claire watching from the doorway. Their eyes met. She looked away first. That annoyed her more than it should have. So did the fact that every new piece of him made her curiosity more dangerous. She did not want to wonder what had made him like this. She did not want to care why there were shadows under his eyes. She did not want to notice that he ate almost nothing when he was under pressure, or that he sometimes paused outside the chapel on the far end of the property without going in, or that once, from her bedroom window, she saw him standing alone at the family cemetery behind the east wall, motionless in the twilight, like grief had found him, and he was letting it. But fear and curiosity do not cancel each other out. They feed each other. And the more Claire learned, the more determined she became to leave. Ethan's rules, his restraint, his unsettling kindness when he thought no one was watching, none of it changed the one truth she could not ignore. She was still not free, so she began studying the estate the way a prisoner studies routine, shift changes, delivery schedules, which guard smoked behind the greenhouse at dawn, which cameras swept too slowly across the side corridor, which doors opened onto service passages, which window latches were weaker than the others. She pretended to settle in. She ate a little more. She stopped arguing at every meal. She even allowed Mrs. Lawson to bring her into the kitchen once to learn where the tea was kept, and while the older woman spoke about absolutely nothing, Claire memorized every side entrance, every keypad, every blind spot she could find. If Ethan Kane thought she was adapting, good. Let him. The calmer she looked, the easier it would be to disappear when the moment came. What she did not know was that Ethan had already noticed the change, and while he said nothing, he doubled the perimeter the same night. The opportunity came 5 days after the storm. A charity gala was being hosted in one of Ethan's downtown hotels, and for the first time since Claire arrived, the mansion's rhythm changed. Cars came and went. Security was stretched between the house and the event. Tailors, drivers, assistants, florists, caterers, and last-minute staff moved through the lower levels like a controlled flood. Claire stayed out of sight, patient, listening from the upstairs landing as orders traveled from room to room. Ethan left before sunset, in a dark suit that made him look even more untouchable than usual, and just before he stepped into the car, he glanced up at the second-floor window, where Claire stood behind the curtain. He could not possibly have seen her through the tinted glass and the falling dusk, but somehow his head tilted just slightly, as if he knew exactly where she was. Then he got in and the convoy pulled away. The house felt different the moment he left. Lighter, yes, but also less certain, like the center of gravity had shifted. Claire waited another 40 minutes, then moved. She dressed in dark clothes, tucked cash she had stolen from a valet tray into her shoe, slipped a kitchen knife into the waistband at her back, more for courage than usefulness, and used the service stairs Mrs. Lawson assumed she had never noticed. At the bottom, 2 staff members rushed past, arguing about floral arrangements, and Claire slipped through the rear corridor unseen. The side door by the laundry opened onto a narrow path leading toward the greenhouse, and, beyond it, the older stretch of wall where she had first escaped. She moved fast, heart hammering, forcing herself not to run until the last possible moment. Because if anyone shouted, she would sprint. If a dog barked, she would climb. If a guard saw her, she would fight. Anything was better than staying. For the first 30 seconds it worked. No alarms, no voices, no pounding footsteps behind her. The night air hit her face and tasted like freedom. She cut behind the greenhouse, ducked low beneath a hedge, and reached the maintenance gate she had seen one groundskeeper use earlier that week. The lock was old, the latch stiff. Her fingers shook as she worked it, every second feeling stolen. Then it gave. Claire slipped through, pulled it mostly closed behind her, and nearly laughed from the rush of it. She was outside the main perimeter. Not safe, not yet, but outside. She moved through the dark tree line until the property lights faded behind her, then crossed the back service road and kept going toward the highway. She knew enough not to head straight into the city center. Too many cameras, too many places Ethan's name mattered. She aimed instead for a bus terminal 2 towns over, planning to use cash, a fake name, anything that would put miles between herself and the Kane estate before sunrise. Every instinct told her not to trust the quiet. Every story she had ever heard about powerful men told her they never let people simply vanish. But fear was easier to outrun when there was pavement under your feet and no one calling your name. For the first time since that kitchen, Claire let herself imagine the possibility that she might actually make it. She made it as far as the old gas station off Route 11 before the night changed. The place was nearly empty, just one flickering sign, 2 pumps and a clerk inside watching a game on a small television mounted in the corner. Claire bought water, a baseball cap, and a prepaid phone with trembling hands, trying not to look like someone fleeing a private war. She used the restroom, locked herself in a stall, and finally allowed herself 3 full breaths. Then she powered on the phone and stared at the blank screen, trying to decide who in her life she could trust. The answer came quickly and painfully. No one. Her father was useless. Old friends were too easy to trace. Her job was certainly compromised. The police? She almost laughed. Men like Ethan Kane did not exist in a city without pieces of law already bending around them. She was on her own. She stepped out of the restroom, pulled the cap low over her face, and headed for the exit. That was when she saw them. Not Ethan's men. These men were different. 2 black SUVs idling across the street. One man smoking beside the driver's door, heavy shoulders, shaved head, no earpiece, no attempt to blend in. Another leaning against the hood with the kind of patient stillness that felt worse than movement. Their eyes locked onto her at the exact same moment. Claire's stomach dropped so hard she thought she might be sick. She turned immediately, fast but not too fast, and headed toward the back exit instead of the front. The clerk called after her, confused. She didn't answer. By the time she hit the alley behind the station, footsteps were already coming around both sides. This was not a guess. This was a hunt. Claire ran, cutting between dumpsters and a chain-link fence, scraping her shoulder on rusted metal as she squeezed through a gap. But one of the men cursed behind her. Another shouted, "Take her alive!" The words hit harder than any hand. Alive. They were not trying to rob her. They were not random. They knew exactly who she was. Ethan had told the truth. For one wild second, the revelation almost knocked the air out of her more than the fear did. He had not lied. He had not exaggerated. Someone really was waiting for her outside his walls. But understanding the truth did not help her outrun it. She tore down the embankment behind the station, shoes slipping in gravel, lungs burning, and reached the shoulder of the road just as a van swerved too close, forcing her back. Headlights flared. Tires screamed. The 2 men behind her closed in. One grabbed for her arm and missed. She swung the water bottle at his face and bolted across the road. Hearing horns blare and curses explode in the dark. She made it to the far side, stumbled into the ditch, and rolled hard enough to see stars. When she looked up, another set of headlights appeared at the top of the hill, moving far too fast. Black SUV, then another, and another. For one terrible instant, she thought the rival men had more vehicles coming. Then the first SUV cut sideways across the road like a barricade. Doors flew open, and she heard the one voice that made the entire night snap into focus. Get down! Ethan's shout came sharp and furious, and Claire dropped on instinct a second before gunfire cracked through the dark. The world exploded. Men were yelling. Tires screeched. Someone hit the ditch near her and cursed. Claire covered her head, mud soaking through her sleeves as gravel sprayed her face. She had never heard gunfire that close before. Not like this. Not with the air itself seeming to split around her. One of the rival men tried to drag her up by the shoulder, but a blur of black slammed into him so hard, both of them went rolling. Claire looked up just in time to see Ethan drive the man into the side of the SUV with brutal precision, one arm around his throat, the other ripping a weapon from his hand before it fired again. The second rival bolted toward the tree line, only to be cut off by Ethan's security team. It was over in less than 30 seconds, but fear stretches time in strange ways, and by the end of it, Claire was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Ethan turned to her with murder still in his eyes, and for the first time since she had met him, his control was gone. "What did I tell you?" he demanded, grabbing her shoulders hard enough to hold, but not hurt. "What did I tell you?" Claire stared at him, speechless, stunned by the fury in his face, and the fact that beneath it was something even more intense. Terror. Not for himself. For her. She swallowed, trying to breathe. "You followed me." Ethan's laugh was short and humorless. "I had men on every road out of the county the second you touched that gate." Claire should have been outraged. She was, a little. But another truth was standing in front of her, bleeding from a cut above his brow, breathing hard, hands still shaking from the fight. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew they'd come." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I knew they were waiting." "Who are they?" For a moment, he looked like he might refuse again. Then he glanced at the restrained man being shoved into the back of one of the SUVs and made a decision. "People who wanted you before I got to your father," he said. "People who don't ask permission." Claire stared at him, the pieces finally beginning to align in ways she didn't want. Her father had not simply been cornered by one man. He had put her in the sights of multiple predators, and Ethan had stepped in before the worst one could reach her. It didn't absolve him. It did not erase the terror. But it changed the shape of the nightmare. She looked at the blood on Ethan's temple, the rip in his jacket sleeve, the bodyguards securing the scene with grim efficiency, and something inside her shifted against her will. "Why?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Ethan looked at her like he was fighting 3 different answers and hated all of them. "Because," he said at last, "I made a promise." Claire took a shaky breath. "To who?" He stared at her for one beat too long. "Not tonight." It was the wrong answer, and she hated it instantly. "Stop saying that," she snapped, anger rushing in to cover the fear. "Stop acting like you're the only one allowed to know what's happening to my life." Ethan took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "And stop running toward men who would sell pieces of you while you're still alive." The words hit like ice water. Claire recoiled. He saw the shock in her face and closed his eyes for half a second, as if he hated himself for saying it so bluntly. When he opened them again, the fury was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Regret. "Get in the car, Claire." She should have argued. Instead, she climbed into the SUV because her legs no longer trusted the ground. The drive back to the mansion was quieter than the first, but somehow far more intimate. Claire sat in the rear seat, wrapped in a blanket one of the guards had handed her, the stolen cap crushed in her fist, mud on her jeans, heart still racing in uneven bursts. Ethan sat beside her again, closer this time only because there was blood running from the cut near his temple, and Mrs. Lawson, who had apparently come in the second car like she had expected trouble, was pressing gauze against it, while muttering that he was impossible. Claire stared at that scene in disbelief, or the most feared man in the city, sitting still, while an older woman scolded him like an unruly son. Ethan caught her looking and arched a brow. "Say it." Claire blinked. "Say what?" "Whatever sarcastic thing you're thinking." Despite everything, Despite the fear, the chase, the guns, the revelation that he had shadowed every road out of the county, a breath of something dangerously close to laughter almost escaped her. "You bleed," she said instead. One side of his mouth moved again. "Occasionally." Mrs. Lawson clicked her tongue and pressed harder. Ethan hissed. Claire looked away quickly, but not before she saw the tiny crack in him, the momentary human reaction he would never have allowed in front of anyone else. That small, stupid detail stayed with her all the way home. When they reached the mansion, Ethan did something she did not expect. He took her not upstairs, not to her room, but to his private study. It was the first truly personal space of his she had been inside, and the difference was immediate. The room was lined with dark wood shelves full of books that had actually been read. There was a large desk, clean except for a few files, and a single silver frame turned face down. The fireplace was lit. One wall held maps, another held locked cabinets. It smelled faintly of leather, cedar, and the same clean cologne that seemed to follow him everywhere. Ethan closed the door behind them and, for the first time since the gas station, let the silence settle. Claire stood in the center of the room, arms crossed tight over herself, not sure if she wanted answers or feared them more, but Ethan poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to her. She didn't take it. He set it down without comment. "You can't leave again without telling me," he said. Claire laughed bitterly. "That's your takeaway?" "It's the immediate one." "You had me followed. I had roads covered." "That's the same thing." "No," Ethan said, his voice suddenly sharper. "If I had you followed, they would have stopped you before the gas station." Claire froze. The truth in that was undeniable. He saw it land and continued, quieter now. "I let you get far enough to prove what I already knew. They were waiting outside my perimeter. Now I know how close they're willing to come." Claire stared at him. "You used me as bait?" The accusation came out raw, and for the first time that night, Ethan looked genuinely angry. "No." The single word hit hard enough to silence the room. "If I wanted bait, I would have put 10 decoys on the road and stayed home. I went myself." He stepped closer, eyes locked on hers, every line in his face tight with something she could not quite name. "You think I wanted to watch you run into that?" Claire opened her mouth and found no answer. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing his control back into place. "You wanted proof," he said. "Now you have it." Claire looked down at the untouched glass of water, at her own muddy reflection in the dark window beyond his desk, at the impossible man standing in front of her, who seemed to be both jailer and shield, and the confusion inside her became almost unbearable. "I don't understand you," she said, and the admission felt more vulnerable than anger ever had. As Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the one thing that would stay with her long after the night ended. "That makes 2 of us." He turned away as if the conversation were over, but Claire's eyes fell on the silver frame lying face down on his desk, and before she could stop herself, she reached for it. Ethan moved faster than she expected, catching her wrist before her fingers touched the metal. The contact was brief but electric, his hand warm, firm, careful even in its urgency. Claire looked down at where he held her, then up at his face. Something in him had changed instantly. Not anger, alarm. "Don't," he said. The word came out rougher than usual. Claire pulled her hand back slowly. "Why?" Ethan stared at the frame for a moment, then turned it over himself. Claire's breath caught. The photograph inside was old, or faded at the corners but unmistakable. A younger woman with Claire's eyes and smile stood beside a teenage boy, who could only be Ethan, though thinner, harder, not yet fully the man he would become. Claire's pulse went wild. "That's my mother." Ethan said nothing. Claire looked at him in disbelief. "Why do you have a picture of my mother?" The silence that followed was the loudest one yet, and when Ethan finally lifted his gaze to hers, Claire knew with terrifying certainty that the truth she had been begging for was about to change everything she thought she knew about her father, about Ethan, and about why she had really been brought into this house. Claire stared at the photograph in Ethan Kane's hand, as if the world had just shifted beneath her feet. Her mother's face, had frozen in a moment long before grief and debt and fear had swallowed everything, smiled out from the silver frame with a warmth Claire had not seen in years, except in fading memories. Beside her stood a younger Ethan, maybe 17, maybe 18, leaner, harder around the eyes, already carrying the kind of caution boys should never have to learn too early. Claire looked from the photograph to Ethan and back again, and for the first time since this nightmare began, even anger failed her. "How do you know my mother?" she asked. But the question was too small for what she was really asking. What else has been a lie? What else was hidden from me? How long have I been walking through a story everyone else already understood, except me? Ethan did not answer right away. He set the frame down carefully, almost reverently, and moved to the fireplace as if he needed distance from the truth before he could speak it aloud. Claire hated that silence now more than ever. "Don't do that," she said, her voice tight. "Don't shut me out again. Not after tonight. Not after all of this." Ethan stood with one hand braced on the mantel, eyes fixed on the fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it. "Your mother saved my life." Claire's breath caught. "What?" He turned slowly, and for the first time, the wall she had spent days crashing into looked cracked all the way through. "Before I was Ethan Kane," he said, "before the businesses, before the men, before any of this, I was just a kid trapped in a house where violence was a language everyone spoke fluently. My father was cruel. My older brother was worse. Your mother worked for us for a short time when she was very young, before she married Richard. She saw things she shouldn't have seen. One night, my father came after me because he thought I'd stolen from him. I hadn't. My brother had. But in that house, truth didn't matter when rage needed a target. Your mother stepped between us. She lied, told him I'd been with her, helping her move supplies, that I couldn't have done what he thought. She took the blow meant for me. She paid for it later. But because of her, I lived long enough to become the man standing in front of you." Claire could barely process the words. Her mother had known Ethan. Her mother had saved him. Her mother, the woman Claire remembered as gentle and overworked and too tired to complain, had once stood in the middle of violence and chosen to protect a boy who had become the most feared man in the city. "Why didn't she tell me?" Claire whispered. Ethan's eyes darkened with old grief. "Because after she left, she wanted distance from that world. She married your father and tried to build a life that had nothing to do with men like my family. For a while, I think she believed she had." Claire swallowed hard. "And you? You just disappeared?" Ethan gave a bitter half-laugh. "I tried." He looked down at his hands for a moment, as if remembering the weight of years she had never seen. "I left that house at 19, built what I could, took over what I had to. I made choices I'm not proud of. I became the kind of man people fear because fear is the only currency some men respect. But I never forgot what your mother did for me. When I heard she died, I looked into it. Not because I wanted anything, because I owed her more than silence." Claire's heart pounded harder. "And then what?" Ethan met her gaze. "Then I found out your father had started borrowing from the wrong people. At first it was small, then it wasn't. I paid off 2 of his debts anonymously. He took out 3 more. I warned him once through an intermediary. He ignored it. I kept watching because I knew if he kept going, eventually he would use the only thing he had left." Claire went cold all over. "Me." Ethan did not deny it. "Yes." The room felt too small for the truth now. Claire backed away from the desk, one hand pressed to her mouth, mind racing through every excuse her father had ever made, every late rent payment, every lie, every time he'd promised things would get better. "So you were watching me the whole time?" she asked, and even now the question came out with hurt, buried under the shock. Ethan's face tightened. Not the way you think. Then tell me how I'm supposed to think, Ethan. She was shaking again, but not from fear this time. From betrayal, layered over betrayal, until it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began. You knew my mother. You watched my father self-destruct. You watched me live my life, and said nothing. Ethan took the accusation without flinching. Would you have believed me? Claire opened her mouth and found no answer, because the honest truth was no. She wouldn't have. If a powerful stranger had approached her months ago and told her her father was circling disaster, and that dangerous men would one day use her name as collateral, she would have called the police. They called her father, called anyone but him. Ethan saw that realization cross her face and continued, quieter now. I kept my distance until I couldn't. When Richard tried to put your name on a private line of credit he couldn't cover, that got attention. Men started asking questions. Men started making offers. By the time I learned he had agreed to meet with Victor Salazar's people, it was already too close. Claire frowned. Victor Salazar? Ethan's expression hardened instantly. The man whose people were waiting at that gas station. He runs a trafficking network behind legitimate shipping routes. Debt collection is just one door he uses. If he had taken possession of you, there would have been no contract, no room upstairs, no Mrs. Lawson, no second chances. The words landed like a punch to the chest. Miss Claire sank into the chair behind her without meaning to, her legs suddenly unreliable. My father knew. Ethan's silence answered before his mouth did. He knew enough. Claire stared at him in horror. No! Ethan stepped closer but stopped when she flinched. Claire. No. Tears flooded her eyes now, hot and immediate, because this truth was somehow worse than the original betrayal. Desperation could be mourned. Weakness could be hated. But knowing, understanding what kind of men were involved and still putting her name in their mouths, that was something else entirely. He knew what they were, she whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. He told himself whatever he needed to in order to survive another day. But men like your father are experts at turning evil into an inconvenience if it keeps the consequences off their own skin. Claire cried then. Not the loud kind, not the kind that asks for comfort, but the quiet, broken kind that comes when the last excuse dies. Ethan stood there as if every instinct in him wanted to close the distance, and every ounce of discipline in him knew he had no right. Why didn't you just tell me from the start? She asked at last, wiping at her face angrily. Why make me think you were part of it? Ethan looked genuinely exhausted. Because the second I told you about your mother, about what your father had done, about Salazar, you would have gone straight to Richard. You would have confronted him. You would have demanded answers. And if he panicked, he would have run to the nearest man, promising protection. Claire knew he was right. She hated that he was right. So you let me hate you instead. Ethan held her gaze. I could live with that. The answer was simple. Too simple. It landed somewhere deep and dangerous in her chest. Claire looked away because she didn't know what to do with a truth like that. For days she had been building herself against him, using anger as armor, insisting that every moment of restraint, every strange act of protection, every look she caught on his face when he thought she wasn't paying attention, all of it was manipulation. But if this was true, then Ethan Kane had stepped into her father's mess, not to buy her, but to keep a promise to a dead woman who once saved a frightened boy from becoming a corpse in his own house. And somewhere in the middle of that promise, he had chosen to take on her life, like it mattered. The realization made it harder to breathe. The next morning, Claire demanded to see her father. Ethan refused immediately. She demanded again. He said no. She accused him of controlling her. He told her he was keeping Richard alive. That answer stopped her cold. What does that mean? Ethan looked toward the window as if measuring how much time they still had before the next problem arrived. It means Salazar thinks Richard may still have access to something he wants. It means your father is useful for now. And it means if you go near him before I know exactly where the leaks are, you paint a target on both of you." Claire crossed her arms, furious and grieving and exhausted. "Or you can't keep deciding what I'm allowed to know." "No," Ethan said. "But I can decide whether I let you walk into a kill zone. Stop talking to me like I'm a child. Then stop acting like your feelings make you bulletproof." The words hit hard enough to silence her. Ethan immediately looked like he regretted the harshness, but he did not take it back. "I'm not trying to punish you, Claire. I'm trying to keep you alive long enough for this to end." "And when does it end?" she demanded. Ethan's face went still in a way she had learned to recognize as dangerous. "When Victor Salazar is no longer a problem." Claire stared at him. "You mean kill him?" Ethan did not answer. He didn't have to. The room seemed to grow colder around them. "That's who you are," she said quietly. Not as an accusation now, but as a realization. "That's the world you live in." Ethan met her gaze, unblinking. "Yes." There was no excuse in him, no attempt to soften it. "And that terrifies me," Claire whispered. "It should," he said. "It terrifies me too." That same afternoon, the mansion was hit. Not with the dramatic warning of sirens or shouted threats, but with the kind of violence that arrives because someone inside opened the door. Claire had just left the library when the first gunshot cracked through the lower hall. For a heartbeat, she thought her mind had invented it. Then glass shattered somewhere downstairs, a guard shouted her name, and the entire house erupted into motion. Ethan appeared at the far end of the corridor almost instantly, moving faster than she had ever seen, one hand already reaching inside his jacket. "Get to the safe room," he ordered. Claire froze. The two guards came running from the stairwell, but before they reached her, a third man stepped out behind them and fired. One guard dropped, the second spun in shock. The shooter was wearing Ethan's security uniform. Inside man. Claire screamed. Ethan fired once, clean and precise, and the traitor hit the floor. There was no time to process it. More footsteps thundered below. Someone was shouting that the west gate had been breached. Another voice yelled that Salazar's men were on the grounds. Ethan reached Claire in 3 strides, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her toward a concealed panel near the end of the hall. "Move!" She stumbled after him, adrenaline burning through her veins. "How are they here?" Ethan's expression was ice and fury. "Because someone sold us out." He shoved open the hidden door to a narrow stairwell behind the wall. But before they could descend, gunfire tore through the corridor again, splintering the frame inches from Claire's head. Ethan turned, pushed her behind him, and fired back with brutal calm. The air filled with smoke and dust, and the deafening rhythm of close-range gunfire. Claire pressed against the wall, hands over her mouth, watching the man she had spent days trying to understand become something terrifyingly efficient. Not wild, not reckless, focused, every movement calculated, every shot deliberate. This was not a man enjoying violence. This was a man who had survived it so long it had become a language his body spoke before thought could catch up. They made it down the hidden stairs to the lower level, but the house was no longer safe. Alarms blared now. Somewhere above them, more glass shattered, or the backup generator kicked in with a hum. Ethan moved Claire through a service tunnel that ran beneath the east wing, one hand on her arm, the other gripping his weapon. "Where are we going?" she asked, breathless. "Garage exit," he said. "There's a secondary route through the vineyards." "And then?" Ethan looked at her with an intensity that made the next words feel like a verdict. "Then I get you out." Claire shook her head instantly. "I'm not leaving you." Ethan actually stopped moving long enough to stare at her like she had lost her mind. "You are absolutely leaving me." "No. Claire. No." The word came from somewhere deeper than logic, deeper than fear. He had hidden things. He had manipulated situations. He had caged her for her own safety. But he had also been the only person in this story who kept stepping between her and the worst of the world. And the idea of running while men with guns closed in on him made something in her chest go sharp and unbearable. Ethan saw it. Whatever he read in her face changed his own. For one suspended second, the tunnel, the alarms, the chaos, all of it seemed to fall away. Then the ceiling above them shook with an explosion, dust raining down, and reality slammed back into place. "We are not doing this here," he said, voice rougher than usual. "Move." They reached the underground garage just as the steel door on the far side began to buckle under incoming fire. Two of Ethan's remaining men were already there, one wounded, both tense. A black armored SUV idled with the rear door open. Ethan shoved a key fob into Claire's hand. "His driver knows the route. He takes you to the lake house. You stay there until I call." Claire stared at the key like it was poison. I said no. Ethan grabbed her shoulders, harder than ever before, not to hurt, but because there was no time left for gentleness. "Listen to me." His voice dropped, and the urgency in it stripped away every layer he usually wore. "If Salazar gets you, he wins. He gets leverage, he gets the ledger, he gets whatever your father hid, and every person in this house dies buying him time. I cannot fight and watch you at the same time." Claire's breath hitched. "The ledger?" Ethan's jaw flexed. Richard took something from Salazar months ago. Account routes, names, payments. Enough to bury half the men who protect him if it ever reaches federal hands. He thought he could trade it for safety. Instead, he painted a target on your entire bloodline. Claire felt sick. "My father has it. Or had it. We haven't found it." Another blast hit the outer door. Metal screamed. One of the guards yelled that they were through. Ethan looked back, then at Claire again, and the next words came like a confession he could no longer hold. "Go. Please." She had never heard him say please before. Not to anyone. Not like that. The sound of it nearly broke her. "Ethan." He cupped the side of her face for one brief, devastating second, thumb brushing rain-dried strands of hair from her temple like the gesture had lived inside him, too long to be stopped now. "If I lose you," he said, his voice low and unsteady in a way that made her heart stop. "None of this means anything." The garage door blew inward before either of them could say more. Men flooded through the smoke. Ethan shoved Claire behind the SUV and opened fire. The next moments came apart in fragments. Shouts, muzzle flashes, a guard going down, tires squealing. Claire crouched low, hands over her ears, then looked up just in time to see one of Salazar's men coming around the side of the vehicle with his gun raised directly at Ethan's back. She moved without thinking. "Ethan!" she screamed. He turned too late. The shot cracked. Ethan jerked. For one horrible instant, Claire thought the world had ended. Then Ethan fired twice, and the attacker dropped. But Ethan staggered, one hand going to his side. Blood spread dark across his shirt. "No!" Claire lunged for him, ignoring the shouts around her, grabbing his arm as he sank to one knee behind the engine block. "No, no, no!" To no. Ethan looked up at her through pain and fury, and something almost like disbelief. "I told you," he gritted out, "to get in the car." Claire was crying openly now, hands pressing against the wound because she had no idea what else to do. "Shut up!" Ethan actually laughed, a broken, breathless sound in the middle of gunfire. "That's not how this works." "Then make it work," she sobbed. "You do not get to die after everything you put me through." Another burst of gunfire cracked overhead. One of his men shouted they had a clear lane out. Ethan's face tightened with pain, but his eyes never left hers. And then, with death and chaos closing in around them, he said the truth he had been holding back from the beginning. "I didn't buy you, Claire." His voice was ragged now, every word torn from somewhere real. "I saved you because I owed your mother. I kept you because I couldn't stop. Somewhere between watching you fight me and watching you refuse to break, I fell in love with you." Claire froze, tears blurring everything. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing the next words out. "I tried not to. I knew better. I knew what I am. But I love you, and if you stay here another second, I will die before I can protect you again." She kissed him before she could think better of it. In the middle of smoke and blood and sirens and shouting, Claire grabbed his face and kissed him like it was the only answer her body understood. It was not soft. It was desperate, trembling, soaked in terror and grief and the kind of truth that arrives too late to be neat. Ethan's free hand came up to the back of her neck for one breathless second, and when they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. "Go," he whispered. Claire shook her head, even as the armored SUV door slammed open beside them. "Together." Ethan looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, something fierce and almost proud flashed through the pain. "Fine," he said. "Together." With the help of his last two men, they got him into the back of the vehicle. The driver punched through the side exit, while bullets struck the armored panels in brutal bursts. Claire pressed both hands to Ethan's wound, crying and swearing and refusing to let go, as the SUV tore through the back road into the vineyards beyond the estate. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, but every time his eyes opened, he looked for her first. Once, halfway through the winding road, he caught her wrist weakly and said the words that would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. "You came back." Claire leaned over him, tears falling onto his face. "I never really left." Ethan survived. Barely. The surgeon at the lake house worked for him for reasons Claire never asked about, and by dawn, the bleeding was under control. The bullet had missed anything immediately fatal by inches. Ethan slept for nearly a full day, while Claire sat beside the bed in borrowed clothes, dried blood still under her nails, replaying everything over and over until her mind felt raw. She should have been resting. She should have been grieving the version of her life that no longer existed. Instead, she stayed in that chair and watched the rise and fall of his chest like her own heart had tied itself to the rhythm. When he finally woke, pale and exhausted, the first thing he did was search for her with unfocused eyes. Claire leaned forward immediately. "I'm here." He stared at her for a moment, like he didn't trust the evidence, then let out a breath so faint it was almost a laugh. "You're terrible at following instructions." Claire's own laugh came out broken and wet with leftover tears. "You noticed?" Ethan tried to sit up, failed, winced. Claire pushed him gently back into the pillows. "Don't." He studied her face in the silence that followed, and there was no wall left in him now. "I meant what I said." Claire's throat tightened. "I know." Ethan looked away first, which shocked her more than the confession itself. "You don't owe me anything because I said it. Not after this. Not after the way this started." Claire took his hand before she could talk herself out of it. "I'm not here because you said it," she whispered. "I'm here because when everyone who should have protected me failed, you didn't." Ethan's fingers tightened around hers. The room held still around them. But stories like this do not end with a hospital bed and a confession. Not when men like Victor Salazar are still breathing. 2 nights later, Ethan was barely strong enough to stand, but standing was exactly what he did when the final piece of the puzzle arrived. One of his men intercepted Richard Bennett trying to flee across state lines with a false passport and a lockbox. Inside the lockbox was the missing ledger, wrapped in plastic, hidden beneath old photographs, and a cheap bottle of whiskey, like guilt and denial, packed together for one last road trip. Ethan had Richard brought not to the mansion, now half in ruins, but to an old safe property outside the city where the walls were thick and the truth had nowhere left to hide. Claire insisted on being there. Ethan argued. Claire won. When Richard was dragged into the room, hands bound, face bruised, eyes wild with fear, Claire almost didn't recognize him. This was not the father from her childhood, not even the weak man from the kitchen. This was a cornered coward with nowhere left to run. The moment he saw Claire, he dropped to his knees and started crying. "Baby, listen to me, I can explain." Claire felt nothing at first. No rage, no pity, just emptiness. "Explain what?" she asked. "That you sold me? That you knew who Salazar was? That Mom died, and you still used me to keep yourself breathing?" Richard sobbed harder. "I never wanted them to hurt you." Claire's laugh was hollow. "As you put my name in their mouths." Richard shook his head wildly. "I thought Ethan would take you. I thought he'd keep you safe." Ethan, leaning against the far wall with one hand braced over healing ribs, went still. Claire turned slowly back to her father. "You knew that too?" Richard looked at Ethan like a man looking at a lifeboat he no longer deserved. "Your mother told me once, before she died. She said if anything ever happened, if things got bad, Ethan would remember. She made me promise I'd never go near him unless there was no other choice." Claire felt the room tilt. "So you used that?" Richard broke completely. "I thought if Ethan got involved, Salazar wouldn't touch you. I thought I could buy time." Claire stepped closer, each word colder than the last. "You didn't buy time. You sold me a lie and prayed someone better than you would clean it up." Richard started begging then, for forgiveness, for protection, for another chance. He said he was scared, said he had meant to fix it, said Salazar had pressured him, threatened him, promised him money if he turned over the ledger and Claire's location. He admitted he had almost done it twice before. He admitted Ethan had paid off debts he never thanked him for. He admitted he had gone back anyway. Each confession was another brick sealing the coffin of the man Claire once called Dad. Ethan said nothing through all of it. He did not need to. The truth was punishment enough. When Richard finally collapsed into sobbing silence, Ethan spoke with the terrifying calm of a man who had already decided the shape of the ending. "Salazar will come for the ledger," he said. He thinks Richard still has it. He thinks Claire is still leverage. So we give him one last chance to make a mistake." Claire turned to him instantly. "No." Ethan looked at her. "It's over if he comes out into the open." Claire's face hardened. "You are not using yourself as bait again." One of the men in the room actually looked down to hide a reaction. Ethan's mouth almost moved. "You're very commanding for someone who was climbing my walls a week ago. And you're very stubborn for someone who was just shot." The exchange should have been absurd in a room full of betrayal and armed men, but it cut the tension just enough for breath to return. Ethan's gaze softened in spite of himself. "Claire!" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "No more secrets. No more sacrifices I don't know about. If this ends tonight, it ends with the truth." Ethan held her gaze for a long beat, then nodded once. "Fine. With the truth." The trap was set at the burned-out shell of one of Salazar's abandoned shipping warehouses by the river, the kind of place that looked forgotten enough to attract violence. Richard, terrified and shaking, called Salazar from a monitored line and told him he had the ledger, the girl, and one last chance to buy his way out before federal eyes found the names inside. Salazar, arrogant to the end, took the bait. He arrived just after midnight with 6 men, expecting to scare a desperate gambler and reclaim his leverage. What he found instead was Ethan Kane standing in the center of the warehouse floor in a dark coat over a healing wound, Claire hidden behind reinforced crates with a direct line of sight to everything, and 6 silent men waiting in the shadows for the order to move. Salazar laughed when he saw Ethan. Actually laughed. "You should be dead," he said. Ethan's answer was cold enough to frost the air. "You first." The next minute unraveled exactly the way men like Salazar always believe they can control until they can't. He reached for a weapon. Ethan's men moved. Gunfire ripped through the warehouse. Crates splintered. Glass shattered. Richard screamed and dropped flat. Claire stayed where Ethan had told her, every nerve lit on fire, every instinct fighting the order to stay hidden. Then she saw it. A second shooter above the catwalk, someone Ethan's men had missed, lining up a shot straight at Ethan's exposed side. Claire didn't think. She grabbed the small pistol Ethan had forced into her hand earlier, just in case, stood, and fired. The recoil slammed through her arm. The shot struck the railing beside the man, enough to throw his aim wide. His bullet tore through the air and missed Ethan by inches. Ethan looked up, saw the catwalk, saw Claire standing in the open, and something feral flashed across his face. The shooter fired again. Ethan moved faster than pain should have allowed, crossing the floor and tackling Claire behind cover, just as the bullet shattered the crate where her head had been. He hit the ground hard with a curse, twisting to shield her completely with his body. For one suspended second, the entire world narrowed to his breath against her hair and the thunder of her own heart. Then it was over. Salazar fell trying to run for the rear exit. Caught between Ethan's men and the authorities Ethan had anonymously tipped with the ledger's contents an hour earlier. Sirens screamed outside. Federal agents flooded the perimeter. Men shouted commands. Weapons hit concrete. Richard was dragged up, pale and trembling, no longer useful to anyone. Ethan rose slowly, favoring his side, then reached down and helped Claire to her feet with a hand that shook only once. She looked at him, chest heaving, and there in the wreckage of everything that had brought them here, with the river wind pushing through broken windows and blue lights flashing across his face, she understood the final truth. Ethan Kane had never been her prison. He had been the line standing between her and the kind of darkness that would have erased her. He had made terrible choices. He had forced decisions on her. He had hidden things, controlled things, carried too much in silence because that was the only way he knew to survive. But when it mattered most, he had never once stepped back. Not from her father. Not from Salazar. Not from bullets. Not from the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone he thought he had no right to love. Claire looked at him and said the words that had been building inside her since the garage. "I ran from you because I thought you were the danger." Ethan's face tightened with something like pain. "Claire," she stepped closer and cut him off. "You were the only one keeping me alive." After Salazar's arrest, the city exploded with rumors, headlines, investigations, and the kind of quiet panic that spreads when powerful men realize their names might be written in someone else's ledger. Richard Bennett took a deal. It did not save him. It only changed the kind of cell that would hold him. Claire never visited. She mourned him in the strangest way possible, not as the man he had become, but as the father she lost long before he signed that paper. The mansion was repaired slowly, though Ethan offered to sell it more than once. Claire refused to answer at first when he asked what she wanted. That, more than anything, terrified him. He gave her everything instead. A bank account in her own name. Full access to the evidence about her mother. Legal documents voiding every false agreement Richard had signed. A passport. Keys. A choice. "No guards," he told her one evening, weeks later, standing in the same foyer where she had first arrived, soaked and furious. "No locked gates, no debt, no conditions. If you want to leave, you leave free." Claire stood there with the envelope in her hands, staring at the man who had once chased her through the rain, and now looked more afraid of her answer than of any gun ever pointed at him. "And if I stay?" she asked softly. Ethan's throat moved as he swallowed. "Then you stay because you choose to. Not because anyone sold you. Not because I saved you. Not because you owe me. Because you want to." The silence that followed stretched long enough to hurt. Claire looked down at the keys, the passport, the papers, then back at him. She could leave. She could walk out the door, get in a car, vanish into a life that had nothing to do with men like Ethan Kane. And maybe once, that would have been all she wanted. But love does not always arrive in clean places. Sometimes it arrives in the middle of fire, or in the shape of the person you feared most, in the hands that caught you when the rest of the world let you fall. Claire set the envelope down on the table beside the door and took 3 slow steps toward him. Ethan did not move. Maybe he didn't trust himself to. "I hated you," she whispered. "I know. I was terrified of you. I know. I ran from you every chance I got." Something almost like a smile touched his mouth. "Believe me, I know." Claire's own smile broke through tears she hadn't planned on. Then she lifted a hand to his chest, right over the scar beneath his shirt where Salazar's bullet had nearly ended everything. "And somehow," she said, voice trembling with the weight of the truth, "you became the only place that feels safe." Ethan closed his eyes like the words physically struck him. When he opened them, not every wall was gone. He touched her face the same way he had in the garage, But this time there were no bullets, no smoke, no men screaming in the dark, just the two of them, standing in the wreckage of what they had survived. "Claire," he said, her name more prayer than sound, "if you choose this, it won't be easy." She gave a shaky laugh. "When has anything with you ever been easy?" The answer that followed was not spoken. It was the way he kissed her, like a man who had been denying himself for too long, careful at first, almost disbelieving, then with the kind of fierce tenderness that made everything she had endured feel like it was finally breaking open into something new. Not ownership, not debt. Choice. Mutual, hard-won, dangerous, real. Months later, the city still talked about Ethan Kane and the woman who had changed him, and some called her foolish, some called her brave, some said she should have run farther, some said she had done what no one else ever managed, and reached the part of Ethan Kane that still remembered being human. The truth was less dramatic and far more powerful. Claire did not stay because he was feared. She did not stay because he rescued her. She did not stay because trauma can blur the shape of love. She stayed because when the smoke cleared and every lie had been dragged into daylight, Ethan gave her the one thing no one else in this story ever truly offered: freedom. And she chose him anyway. That is what made it love. Not the chase, not the danger, not the bullets. The choice, the final one. The one made in full knowledge of who he was and who he had been, with nothing hidden and nothing owed. And if there is one truth this story leaves behind, it is this. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is not the one who destroys you. Sometimes he is the one who steps into the fire, bleeds for you, and then opens the door wide enough for you to leave, trusting that if what exists between you is real, you will walk back on your own. Claire did, and that decision changed both their lives forever. But before this story truly closes, there is one final detail that still leaves people arguing to this day. 3 weeks after Salazar's arrest, while the last repairs were being done at the mansion, Mrs. Lawson found a sealed envelope tucked inside one of the books in Claire's room. The book Ethan had placed there before she ever arrived. Inside was a letter in her mother's handwriting, old and carefully preserved, as one Ethan had clearly held on to for years, without ever opening once the seal was placed. The letter had been addressed simply, "For my daughter, if Ethan ever finds you before I do." Claire opened it with shaking hands. Her mother wrote only a few lines, but they were enough to stop time. She said that if Claire was reading this, it meant the world had turned cruel in a way she prayed it never would. She said Ethan was not born gentle, but he was born loyal, and that loyalty had once cost her pain, but saved a life worth saving. She said that if Ethan stood between Claire and danger, Claire should not mistake the harshness of his methods for the emptiness of his heart. And the final line, the one that made Claire cry so hard she had to sit on the floor, was this: "What if the world ever forces you to choose between the man who says he loves you and the man who proves it? Choose the one who stays." Claire folded the letter with trembling fingers, walked downstairs, and found Ethan in the study by the fire, where so many truths had first been spoken. She didn't say a word. She simply handed him the letter, climbed into his lap despite the healing ribs and his immediate protest, and kissed him until he forgot how to speak. Later, when he finally found his voice, he asked what the letter said. Claire smiled through tears and pressed her forehead to his. It said my mother always had good instincts. And now, after everything you've heard, the question is yours. If you were Claire, would you have forgiven the father who sold you to survive one more day? And if you were standing in front of a man like Ethan Kane, a man feared by everyone else, but willing to burn his empire to keep you alive, would you have run? Or would you have stayed long enough to see the truth? Let us know in the comments, because stories like this never end when the credits roll. They live on in the choices people argue about long after the last word is spoken. And if this story pulled you in from beginning to end, don't forget to subscribe, because the next one will test your heart even more than this.